This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is an archaeologist, a Buber post-doctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and author of the book Prioritizing Death and Society, The Archaeology of Chalcolithic and Contemporary Cemeteries in the Southern Levant, Approaches to Anthropological Archaeology. It was published some time ago by Acumen Press. Dr. Assaf Nativ, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with a general question. Studying cemeteries, ironically or not, can teach us more about the living than about the dead. So what were you hoping to achieve in delving into this subject matter?
Ooh, that's a very general and broad question. Well, there were several things, but probably most importantly, cemeteries as such are under-researched considerably. I mean, they are treated in various ways, but they're often used in order to expand on other issues which are more abstract, more sort of cultural, sociological, and so on. But the cemeteries themselves are treated much less in detail. Mm-hmm. So the idea was basically to focus on them and see what we can do with it.
Mm-hmm. So what really can cemeteries teach us about the living? I mean, about what do burial practices tell us about life? Why did you choose cemeteries and not other areas?
Well, if you want the background of the story, how I got to it, well, it was quite the other way around, because I started my general fascination with the Chalcolithic period, which is roughly 4500 to 3800 BC. Mm-hmm. Which is a fascinating time, and one of the hallmarks are the cemeteries. So I figured, okay, I'd like to study burial practices or mortuary practices, funerary practices, however we want to call it. Mm-hmm. And I started delving into that issue, and it turned out that I just can't. The data isn't enough. Sort of, I can't really extrapolate from the archaeological record something which I feel confident enough in which to deal with the funerary practices themselves. So I sort of turned it around and decided to focus on the cemeteries. And then, lo and behold, how the hell do we deal with cemeteries? Mm-hmm. I mean, as themselves, as a physical, spatial structure. That is basically was the challenge to begin with.
Okay. So tell us indeed a bit about the Chalcolithic period in this corner of the world where the bulk of your research took place. You said there were somewhere around the 5th millennium BC. What were the distinctive features of that period in that society?
Well, first, there seems to be some form of demographic increase in general. I mean, more settlements, more places that were never settled before. There's cross-specialization. Copper comes into the game. Very impressive basalt workshops working. We don't have the workshops, actually. Mm-hmm. Pottery specializations in different forms. Probably some form of social hierarchies come into play. So
this is just when civilization was coming out of the Stone Age, around about that time?
I wouldn't call it that, but there's sort of a sense of some form of leap, if you think of it in evolutionary terms. Mm-hmm. But I'd be cautious on putting that label on it. But there's definitely some form of symbolic explosion going on. Mm-hmm. There's some kind of real symbolic noise in this period. Every time you come across it, it looks different. Sometimes it looks very impressive. Sometimes it looks very dull. Sometimes it has one kind of logic that seems to govern it, and sometimes a completely different one, and it changes just immediately from one side to the next.
And how readily available were the excavation to this end? I mean, do we have enough relics to work with and paint a picture that makes sense?
Well, it's not very well balanced. I mean, still today we know a lot more about the south, basically mostly the northern Negev, than we do, for instance, about the Galilee. Mm-hmm. So there are different biases, also geographical and also other. But there is quite a lot of material to work with, yes.
Mm-hmm. And so what exactly would you say is the essence of that civilizational leap that is embodied in the Chalcolithic period? I'm assuming it means something to you because you chose to focus on that period and not others.
Well, my choice to focus on it was basically it was so enigmatic. On the one hand, it's so sort of to your face. I mean, just it's sort of this explosion of all these new features and diversity and forms of expression which show up there. And then at the same time, it just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. Is it the first time, by the way, in history that we see full-fledged burial practice and some sort of culture around that, or does it differ from the situation that was before?
It's debatable. There are burial grounds much earlier also. Mm-hmm. There are burial grounds much earlier, but it's debatable whether it does or doesn't constitute a cemetery, or in what case, and to what extent was it institutional, and so on. But,
okay, so what were the distinctive features of Chalcolithic cemeteries and burial practices in a way that interests you as a researcher?
Well, the thing with the Chalcolithic is, first of all, they're clearly distinguished in space from the settlements. These are completely separate sites. Mm-hmm. Many of them are located in regions that were actually, as far as we understand, are not that much populated. There are very distinctive ways of treating the skeletons or the bodies. I mean, all human inhumations are secondary, meaning disarticulated bones in various forms and shapes. Some distributed, some put in ossuary, some just piled up on the side. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of symbolic paraphernalia going on in there. I mean, the burial utensils themselves or receptacles are very distinct. They're really kept apart from anything more mundane or quotidian. Mm-hmm. So basically, it's a very distinct institution within the Chalcolithic period. But the fact is that it's not just one; there are many, and they differ from one another. So
even in what is today Israel,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, over very small distances, you see very big.
Such as? What are the big differences?
Well, just the easiest one would be to say that in the northern Negev or in the south, or you have sort of above ground circular chambers built of stones, maybe with perhaps with the mud brick superstructure that's for burial. And a little bit further to the north on the coastal plain, you've got caves. Mm-hmm. And if you go inland a little bit, there are a few cases in which the inhumations were done in natural caustic systems, which were very deep and very damp and have speleothems all over, and it's a real sort of mystical experience. Is
there any symbolic value to it, or is it just because of the conditions, the physical conditions on the ground that they were done in different ways?
Well, these things go together, but yeah, I think there's a lot of symbolic value to it. Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely very significant. Also, you take into account some of these caves are artificial. They were hewn into the rock, especially, for instance, those in the Kokar. And then you've got those which are natural, and they have different structures, and they differ from one case to the next. And
that is something that really, the next question is about something that really, really struck me. Why compare them to contemporary cemeteries? Aren't we dealing with apples and oranges here? After all, we have a few millennia that splits them apart.
Yeah, but that was exactly the point, though, to compare. The thing is with archaeology and archaeological interpretations in general and thought is that we usually have, almost unavoidably, we introduce considerable logical leaps in our accounts. There's a big gap very often between our empirical work, in which we explore the finds and the distributions and all that kind of stuff, and then how we explain them. Mm-hmm. And the explanation usually relies on other models that we adapt from anthropology, sociology, history, anywhere it's relevant. And this, in a sense, forms a kind of a problem. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons, if you'd like, that cemeteries are underrepresented in the research as objects as such is precisely because of this. Because we define our agendas and what we want to study according to the topics of interest that float around in other places. So the thought was, okay, if this is the condition, how do we...
So basically what you're saying is that cemeteries don't interest other disciplines?
Oh, I wouldn't say it that way. No, I wouldn't say it that way.
So what do you mean by that?
I mean that the cemeteries don't interest them as such. I mean, the cemetery is a vehicle in order to discuss social structure or symbolism or death, which is completely abstract phenomena, and so on, or gender relations. I mean, it goes all over the place. I mean, because cemeteries are very rich in material, but then again, the cemetery. So all these patterns that we explore don't serve to explain the cemetery as an institution, as a physical phenomenon in space, but they serve in order to tell us all sorts of other things. So the question was basically how to study the physical institution. And here, this is where the book basically becomes a form of an exercise. I say, okay, a lot of our ideas and thoughts come from the fact that we can produce distinctions, right? So we say black and white, we say up and down, and so on and so on. The binary is the easiest way to do it, or to formulate things. So what if instead of looking for binaries or looking for distinctions within the record, we produce it? And then we just keep working on the distinction, distilling from it what seems to be perhaps the most important feature of the phenomenon. So the idea was basically to take something contemporary, two different things. That's the basic structure, two very different things, and using them as two distinctions, one that shines on the other, basically. Each one will say something about the other, and then continuously distilling it. Using a contemporary context was sort of an attempt to hit two birds with one stone, basically, both saying something about ourselves, where we stand in relation to the Chalcolithic, or what the Chalcolithic can say about us, and at the same time inserting myself, because there's always a subject-object problem in every scholarship, both inserting myself or my cultural background into the research.
But wouldn't it be better, after all, to learn more about the Chalcolithic, to compare them to another prehistoric civilization that's actually closer to them temporally?
Better for what?
I don't know. It's just that it's like they're so far apart that. But you're saying that it doesn't really matter? Well,
at the analytic or theoretical level, I don't think it really matters. If these are distinct cultures, then they're just as distinct. Just here, we've got the extra benefits of learning something about ourselves. And anyway, what happens in the end, all our research and all our attempts to understand the past and what comes with it, is in the end we're concerned with who we are and what we are doing here and now. So,
all right. So, what can the Chalcolithics tell us about ourselves, Israel, in the 21st century?
Well, in the end, I think the main observation that came out from it is our obsession with death, and our cemeteries are absolute reflections of that. Something that probably the Chalcolithic wasn't. Sort of a form of a bottom line, if you'd like, of the book is that a cemetery is not one thing. A cemetery is a conflation of two basically distinct institutions. One is an institution of death, funerary practices, and so on, which are formulating themselves. And the other one is a much more social institution, which has to do with the relationship between individuals, individuals or groups within the individuals. And the impression was that when setting the contemporary cemeteries, our Israeli contemporary cemeteries, against the Chalcolithic cemeteries, is that the Chalcolithic cemetery is concerned with these social relations much more. Death or funerary practice and so on are vehicles in which to articulate social relationships. Whether these were actually the social relationships in practice, it's hard to tell, because cemeteries often produce ideals. But this seems to be the main function. This was mostly what they were concerned about. It wasn't about how to treat the body so much. It was how to arrange it, and how to arrange it in space, and how to arrange it in different forms, and how this transforms over time. What happens in contemporary cemeteries, it's exactly the reverse. Death is sort of like the main issue of the cemetery. That's why the cemetery is a real symbol of death. I mean, we use it today in popular literature, movies.
So you're saying it's a modern thing, that in prehistoric times it was the exact opposite?
I can say that in Chalcolithic it wasn't that way.
Okay.
It could have been also before. I mean, I wouldn't exclude it, but yeah, it does seem to be a very modern phenomenon where death basically rules over. I'm not also sure it would be correct in all places of the world today. I mean, probably the West, but also in the West, you've got all sorts of things coming in, sort of forest burials, and of course cremation goes on. Yeah. But here, definitely in Israel, Death is
is a significant feature of our lives. All right,
much.
Dr. Assaf Nativ, an archaeologist, a Buber post-doctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and author of the recently published Prioritizing Death and Society, the Archaeology of Chalcolithic and Contemporary Cemeteries in Southern Levant. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
In the middle of all nights, the stars so far. On the sidewalk of my mind, a so far star. From eve to dawn, I will go for him, surrendered and blind into his arms on mine. Mine. 'Cause every time I look in your eyes, I feel like I'm drowning. Your smile is everything that I need every day, every morning. To make love, from my neck to my hair, all I need is your care. Surrender my heart, I'm so glad that you're mine. 'Cause every time